I thank you so very much. And when I hear the word respect, how deeply thankful I am to everyone that to have this moment of respectful sharing and speaking from a disability perspective. As we have watched the progression of MAiD legislation, many persons with a disability have felt left out of the discussion. And this invitation today speaks volume to all of the work you're doing and the kindness you're showing in opening these doors with invitations. So I'm truly appreciative. But also, and as you noted, be clear to everyone that yes, I did have a spinal cord injury over 40 years ago, and I think I've accumulated quite a bit of personal and professional experience from a disability perspective due to that. However, I do speak from a perspective of a wheelchair user. I use a powered chair, and of course, that by no means speaks for all disability perspectives. And so I am but one in a multidimensional cognitive wheel as we speak from this perspective. But I thank you as we discuss the insights, because where I believe if there's a overarching theme from a disability perspective, that is the paradox of freedom, or the purported freedom to choose MAiD is, from a disability perspective, highly paradoxical, because the freedom of informed consent for MAiD, when seen from a disability perspective, is something of a fallacy, because it's underpinned, or rather, you have a right to freedom of choice. At the same time, when so making that choice, freedom is lost because the processes, the procedures, the policies are in fact controlled by an entirely separate body. And that, of course, is the medical legal structure. So freedom becomes paradoxical within the context of MAiD from a disability perspective. And I hope today to talk about that, of freedom underpinned in MAiD, underpinned by utilitarian and a neoliberal ethos that promotes MAiD in the name of freedom, but it ignores the deeply rooted but subtle oppressions that, with politicians ignoring the history of discrimination and eugenics within Canada. There is the medical community often lacks disability awareness, but they have the power of assessing eligibility, and a jurisprudence or a judiciary that is often ambivalent, or at worst, irresponsibly naive when it comes to making decisions with respect to MAiD. This puts us squarely in a difficult position. I hope to address each one of these where we see there is a linkage between a perception of a right to life and equality. They are inextricably linked, but at this point in Canada, there has been a dividing line that confuses the disability community. Now, at a substantive level, eligibility, and I'd like to talk about first how one becomes eligible for MAiD, so that we have an understanding of just what we're speaking about. In order for one to receive medical assistance in death in Canada, according to Section 241 of the Criminal Code, they must be 18 years old. They must make a voluntary request. They must be eligible for government-funded health care. They must have informed consent to receive medical assistance in dying after having been informed of means that are available to relieve their suffering. And this does include palliative care. They must be capable of making decisions. and they must have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. Now, I am moving through this rather quickly. It is more complex, but I wish to only, given the dilemma of time, just hit on the high points for all of you. Now, grievous and irremediable condition is defined as a person has a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability. There's that word. Disability is directly in MAiD legislation. The person is in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability or non-ability. The illness, disease, or again, disability, or the state of decline causes enduring physical or psychological suffering. Now this is very interesting because the physical or psychological suffering must be intolerable and cannot be relieved under conditions that the person does not consider acceptable. It is a subjective standard, not an objective standard. Now, until recently, it was also necessary for natural death to have become reasonably foreseeable. That has been dropped since Bill C-14, which was passed in March of just last year, 2021. So when natural death is no longer reasonably foreseeable, and I want to focus primarily on that, not the very end of life or when there is no other alternative, but when there is still an expectation of sometimes several years of life, and the only thing that distinguishes it for the individual is that they do have a serious disability. So Bill C-14 was passed and did remove the criteria that death has become reasonably foreseeable for any person seeking MAiD. Now, if in that context, the person seeks MAiD, there must be a 90-day waiting period before it's administered. The period can be shortened, however, if the person is about to lose capacity to make healthcare decisions, and that is as long as both assessments have been completed immediately before the MAiD is provided. Now, the medical practitioner must give the person an opportunity to withdraw their request and ensure that they give express consent. It sounds straightforward, but from a disability perspective, it's important to look under the superficial element of freedom of medical decision-making. We must ask, from a disability perspective, also when the 90-day period begins. If natural death is reasonably foreseeable, then the wait period is less than 10 days. However, in the matter of ABV Canada, Justice Perel from the Ontario Superior Court was highly ambiguous when stating when the 90-day wait period should trigger, because at paragraph 79 of the decision stated natural death need not be imminent, and that what is a reasonably foreseeable death is a person-specific medical question to be made without necessarily making, but not necessarily precluding, a prognosis of the remaining lifespan. That word spaghetti certainly has me somewhat confused. So foreseeable is not imminent, but it is unreasonable to presume that it cannot be imminent. While not being time specific, it is person specific and requires that the person must have a natural death. The judge then decided not to decide in this decision and punted it to the decision to the medical profession, where paragraph 81 stated, these are matters at the core, if not the whole corpus, of medical knowledge and better known to doctors than to judges. And this ambiguity therefore makes it unclear when the 90-day trigger begins. In addition, waiting limited only to 90 days, especially, and I speak from the perspective of someone with a spinal cord injury who has met hundreds and thousands of Canadians and Americans especially who have a spinal cord injury, that right after that accident, adjustment is difficult. I'll tell you and share with you, the day before my accident, I was just 18. I was playing rugby. I was running every day. I'd go for long runs. I practiced with my team. If you would have asked me the day before my accident, do you want to go and spend the rest of your life in a wheelchair? I would have answered, absolutely not. I would have thought that my life would be profoundly diminished. Well, thousands of Canadians do have to face that reality every day, and every year in Canada, with only a 90-day wait period. I submit it's a dangerous limitation, because in fact, all of the empirical data indicates that after about approximately a year or greater after accident or onset of illness or significant illness or disability, individuals with those disabilities will indicate a level of happiness that is equal to their able-bodied peers. In other words, adjustments are made, but it takes over a year. And it's well studied across North America that this is consistent and empirically based. The courts, in addition to this 90-day wait period concern, the courts have made it clear that they will not become involved in monitoring or oversight. In the case of Sorensen versus Swinemar, the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal, they indicated that they would not review the question of MAiD eligibility because there was no justiciable issue, and the courts did not have the institutional capacity for such reviews, except in matters that invoked constitutional oversight or a question of compliance with the criminal code. So where do we turn for second sober thought after a person is found eligible to review MAiD? The federal government and provinces have not answered with a comprehensive regulatory regime that can identify abuse. There is no ability to have a meaningful review of the accuracy of medical assessments, although this is frequently done in other legal realms, such as the Mental Health Act in Ontario, or capacity assessments under the Healthcare Consent Act in Ontario, or of course, as many of you are aware, the Substitute Decisions Act. Also, it is an overbroad presumption that all physicians are equal in talent and analytical skills. The disability community is further alarmed by prejudices within physicians that have been noted in the article Physicians' Perception of People with Disabilities and Their Healthcare, published in 2021. In that, it was found, now that albeit this was amongst US physicians, I believe it is a fair comparable to Canadian physicians also, that 82.4% reported that people with significant disability have worse quality of life than non-disabled people. And 56.5% strongly agreed that they did not want to welcome patients with disability into their practice. This bias certainly gives Justice Peral's term corpus of medical knowledge an ominous ring. And complete deference is handed really to one group, just at the first step of the process, with no second sober thought. So the disability community is left to wonder, what about us? Where is our statement? Where do we have input as a community that is thoughtful, multiple, some importance in speaking of the value and place of citizenship of ourselves in Canada? And amidst the universal condemnation by the disability community, they do have to ask why. Why political disregard by cavalierly including the word disability in the legislation? Why judicial ambiguity, disregard, perhaps even irresponsible naivety? And why deference to a medical community as if it is a monolith and not a grouping of individuals with differing levels of skills, experience, and biases? The disability community is at the point in Canada where many have to ask, is fair foul and is fair is foul and foul is fair? Now, you may ask whether this is just the view of a radical fringe. It's not. It's quite not. There's a committee of UN experts fully agree, and they stated to the Canadian Senate in just this past January 25th, 2021. Sorry. Jared Quinn, Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Olivier de Schutter, Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, and Claudia Mahler, Independent Expert on the Enjoyment of All Human Rights by Older Persons, indicated with alarm, and I quote, "Disability should never be a ground or justification to end someone's life, directly or indirectly." So in its current form, the MAiD legislation, I would submit, breaches, it's a violation of Article 10 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Yet Canada proceeds. I want to sort of step back a bit now. After that statement, well, after knowing that there is this international consensus amongst human rights bodies that Canada is in breach of its international human rights obligations, and understand why there is so much concern that there must be respect for the inherent right to life on an equal basis for all persons with disabilities. And that is rooted in eugenics, not a far off historical wrong that was just fixed centuries ago. In fact, the roots of eugenics were very evident in the 19th and 20th centuries, and many people will literally dismiss that as being, well, that was just a Nazi Germany matter. And of course, we do know that Hitler did begin and he did put over 300,000 disabled Germans to death in and around 1941-42. But Canada was not alone. It was also had several proponents and political leaders and legislation that supported eugenics. We don't like to think about that, but we did. Now, before I leave that, though, I want to quote to you from the letter that Hitler did sign that triggered the eugenics movement in Germany in 1941. That can be found in the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg in the genocide section. It states, Buller and Dr. Brandt are instructed under their responsibility to extend the powers of physicians to be designated in particular in such a way at human discretion, terminally ill persons can be consecrated mercy in the event of a critical assessment of their state of illness. So here we have human discretion. In other words, the right to choose treatment, and that to treat terminally ill persons is merciful or consecrated mercy. It's prescient within Canada because within the 19th and 20th century, many of you are aware of freak shows and ugly laws. In other words, these were laws that were created in the late 19th and early 20th century to bar persons with disabilities from going in the community. They were forced to be isolated at home, or they would be subject to fines and or imprisonment. By 1912, the first International Eugenics Congress met in London, England, and in attendance was Leonard Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, Winston Churchill, and Alexander Graham Bell. Within Canada, eugenics played a part in Canadian sex instruction, intelligence testing, social education, social welfare, immigration, and birth control to varying degrees. And so by the 20s and 30s, eugenic reasoning in US and Canada resulted in sterilization legislation. Most clearly in both British Columbia and Alberta, where over 2,800 procedures of sterilization were performed in Alberta, with 50 alone occurring as recently as 1972. Accurate statistics are not available from British Columbia because they destroyed the records. And although these extreme and ruthless laws are no longer a part of Canadian legal norms, profound social imbalances, the residual impact of the mid-20th century continues to persist on the question of whether disabled Canadians do not frequently encounter ongoing failure to freely choose because choice is lost within the social context of their life. I'll give you an example. And since the MAiD legislation and the criminal code is federal legislation, I'll quote the federal statistics, where in the Canadian Survey on Disability of 2017, it reported that of Canadians over the age of 15, 22% or 6.2 million Canadians had at least one or more disability. Persons with disabilities were less likely to be unemployed. Although they were available for work, they could not find it. This means 645,000 individuals with disabilities are ready for work and do not have jobs currently. And disabled lone parents and those living alone were the most likely to be living in poverty. There was a double level of discrimination too, because since 8 in 10 lone parents are women, the high risk of living in poverty in this group is disproportionately affecting women. Undereducation, inadequate access to transportation, housing, or primary health care compounds these problems. And with unemployment and poverty leading to broad and pervasive vulnerabilities, creating experiences of oppression and discrimination. In other words, the social determinants of health point to additional risk of poor mental health and risk of suicide if it is not alleviated. And this falls squarely within the realm of choice for MAiD. Very recently, in 2022, the Journal of Ethics and Mental Health, an article by David Albert Jones et al. On suicide entitled Euthanasia, Assisted Suicide, and Suicide Rates in Europe, noted there is no evidence that it would be beneficial in relation to suicide prevention overall to have euthanasia or assisted suicide legislation. Indeed, if one considers the community as a whole, it is not the prohibition of euthanasia, but the introduction of euthanasia legislation that is associated with, and I quote, evidence of premature death, which is a direct quote from the Carter decision. In other words, he's stating that the rationale, one of the rationales utilized by the Supreme Court of Canada in Carter, is incorrect. Empirically, fallacious. Furthermore, the data from Europe and the US indicate that subsequent to the introduction of euthanasia laws, it is women who have most been placed at risk of avoidable premature death from changes in rates of intentional self-initiated death and from changes in rates of non-assisted suicide. Now, ironically, while the disability community has called for funding for disability supports, palliative, and home care, these calls have been ignored while watching a rush to fund and improve the efficacy of access to MAiD without meaningful regulatory oversight. Furthermore, I do ask, I dare anyone to impute a reference to any other equality-seeking group, and when you state you can have assisted dying based on another protected grounds of discrimination, there would be outcry and accusations of bigotry. I would submit it is equally abhorrent to state that disability is a rationale for euthanasia and not worthy of the full splendor of experiencing the human condition. As the UN experts also stated in January, I quote, "We all accept that it could never be a well-reasoned decision for a person belonging to any other protected group, be it a racial minority, gender, or sexual minorities, to end their lives because they are experiencing suffering on account of their status. Therefore, I would submit that the wrong question is being contemplated within the rubric of MAiD. We should not introduce the subjective elements of what it is to suffer intolerably from a grievous and irremediable condition that may reasonably one day lead to death. We should first objectively assess whether we are providing the tools necessary for that person with a disability to live an independent life. Then we may begin to realize what is free, informed, and non-coerced consent. We, persons living with disabilities, we may change our physique, but we do not suffer. We as a community do not go gentle into that good night. We simply move upon the earth's crest in a different way. Give us the tools to do just that, to move within the human condition and upon the crest, the earth's crest, in our own unique way. By clinging to the fallacy that MAiD as it stands, permissive, unquestioned, loosely regulated, divorced from its social and historical underpinning, opens the door to abuse, implicitly promotes rather than permits MAiD, and normalizes premature death due to a condition called disability. And freedom to choose one's life destiny from a disability perspective then becomes just another word for nothing left to lose. Thank everyone for listening, and